Listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to True Crime, the podcast that helps you find new, emerging, and undiscovered true crime podcasts. I'm Greg, the host and curator of True Crime. Today's episode is from Killer Heart to Hearts. Journey with Killer Heart to Hearts to the brutal side of humanity. They spotlight some of the darkest crimes in history. Some rock the world, others have been buried deeper than their victims. If you like today's episode, make sure to check out the episode description for links to subscribe. All right, let's get this show started.
Begin.
This episode of Killer Heart to Hearts discusses potentially triggering topics including drug abuse, devil worship, and murder. Listener discretion is advised. If you grew up in 1980s suburbia, chances are your parents were, at one time or another, legit worried about satanic rituals being carried out in your neighborhood. Nearly everybody was. It became a widespread fear known as satanic panic, whose origin can be traced to the quiet town of Northport, New York, on the shores of Long Island. This is Killer Heart to Hearts.
Welcome back to Killer Heart to Hearts. I'm Elise Budell.
And I'm William Cannon. Thank you for joining us, you guys, for yet another episode about the worst among us. And this week, we go back in time a little bit to Long Island, New York in the 1980s. A simpler time, really, when we weren't all walking around with telephones in our pockets that basically amounted to supercomputers able to produce any information imaginable at the touch of a button. And dare I say a more gullible time, when people might have been a bit more inclined to believe everything they hear?
Yeah, and a time of drugs. Massive amounts of drugs.
Absolutely. The drug problem in the United States really reached new heights in the 1980s, that's for sure. As cocaine found its way out of the inner city nightclub bathrooms and into the suburbs. And this case is one of those whose ramifications directly affected my childhood, my life growing up. And this wasn't too far from me, actually, where this happened.
Yeah, I was about 2 when this happened, and I don't really have a clear recollection of satanic panic specifically, but I do remember hearing about devil worship and stuff like that growing up. I feel like that continued into the 90s with the likes of like Marilyn Manson and stuff entering into the scene, but I wasn't aware of this origin story per se.
Yeah, I don't really remember being aware of the case itself either, but I was 100% aware of the effect it had on people, especially parents. It shifted the entire foundation of what it meant to be a suburban parent of teenage children in America. People went a little nutty.
Yeah, this is definitely an unsettling case because though drugs are involved, I think it's a huge cop-out to say that drugs were the driving force behind anything that happened that night. I mean, I believe that premeditation was involved. Therefore, drugs are kind of a moot point, but I mean, that's just my opinion. I'd actually be really curious to hear what other people think about that. So, take it away.
This is The Acid King. Picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies, and somebody calls you and you answer quite slowly. A girl with kaleidoscope eyes. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles was a massive hit in 1967. And although the song's writer, the late great John Lennon, always claimed the song was inspired by a drawing his then 3-year-old son Julian had drawn at school, it has long been rumored to actually be an homage to the hallucinogenic drug lysergic acid diethylamide. And whether you call it LSD or acid, one thing's for sure. If you were a teen looking for it on Long Island in 1984, Ricky Casso was your guy. Northport, New York, like so many other American suburbs in the 1970s and 80s, saw more than its fair share of drugs. only for affluent Northport, a picturesque suburb about an hour and a half outside of New York City, their drug problem seemed to stem from boredom rather than from destitution. Typical rich kid, teenage rebellion kind of shit. Except when it wasn't. And nothing was typical about Ricky Casso, who started smoking weed at just 11 years old. 11. Richard Allen Casso Jr. was born on March 29, 1967, to a schoolteacher mother and a high school football coach father. And, suffice to say, Ricky struggled, mightily at times, to find where he belonged, what he was good at. He was 13 years old when he met his best friend, Jimmy Troiano, on the football team of all places. Like father, like son? More like willing to try anything. But nothing ever fit. And Ricky wasn't exactly a self-starter either. He lacked motivation. And at 16 years old, Ricky Casso dropped out of high school. What did he do all day, you ask? Drugs. Ricky did drugs. Like all the drugs. And after his father, Richard Allen Casso Sr., a strict disciplinarian, kicked him out of the house, Ricky quickly began selling drugs too. Finally, Ricky found something he was good at. Ricky Casso sold so much LSD on Long Island, he became known as the Acid King. Then there was that one time, Ricky got arrested for grave robbing a human skull, supposedly for some sort of satanic sacrificial ceremony or something. Hold up. Too much too soon? Too much alliteration? Let me back up. Ricky Casso met Satan at the library. Well, not exactly met Satan at the library, but definitely discovered Satanism was a thing at the library, and Ricky was immediately drawn in by its me-first, carnal mission statement of, basically, do whatever the fuck makes you feel good. It sounds easy enough, until you're given the bill and the price is your soul. But Ricky Casso, turns out, was more than willing to pay that price.
Yeah, I feel like the 80s and 90s were kind of an era where Satanism became a fad. Like, parents were terrified of their kids listening to heavy metal because that meant that they worshiped the devil or something. You don't hear that so much anymore, but back then, that was a huge concern.
Right, it was all these latchkey kids playing video games and watching MTV with little guidance from their parents. And then those are the same parents that then blame MTV when their kid lashed out or turned violent, instead of owning up to their own, lack of parenting. But Ricky Casso's particular brand of Satanism was rooted less in the religion's traditions and practices, and more in the image Satanists projected. The t-shirts they wore, and the heavy metal music they blared. Or at least what Ricky Casso imagined a true Satanist might. He had never actually met any. But nevertheless, Ricky began collecting a group of similar, like-minded lost souls who, for the most part, were most likely just hanging around and half-assing their own feigned interest in devil worshipping because, hey, Ricky Casso supplied the drugs. They called themselves the Knights of the Black Circle, but they were mostly just kids in concert t-shirts yelling "Hail Satan" and shit at yuppies on Main Street and hanging out in the cemetery. And drugs. Always drugs. Things got so bad with the drugs that Ricky ended up in rehab, which in some ways was a welcome upgrade for him from living in his car, as he had been since his dad kicked him out. Yet the streets were exactly where Ricky returned to after he was released from rehab and immediately began using again. In April of 1984, trying to clean up before a court appearance, Ricky snuck back into his parents' house for a shower, where he was discovered by his father, who ended up giving Ricky a ride to court. And after the hearing, Ricky's dad then dropped Ricky off near a convenience store. but refused to give his son any money. An enraged Ricky then kicked a dent in the car door, and his father banished him not only from the house, but from the family entirely. No contact. It was fine by Ricky. Drugs were all he needed. Shortly after, on April 24th, 1984, a few of the Knights of the Black Circle partook in the long-standing suburban tradition of partying in the woods, treading upon the well-worn footsteps of nearly every American teenager that came before them, while at the same time somehow carrying more drugs than all those that came before them combined. And PCP was the flavor of the night. They smoked bags of it out there. And by this time, Ricky's drug use had increased exponentially, so it wasn't surprising when he passed out. What was surprising, however, was when his friend, 17-year-old Gary Lauwers, then went fishing through Ricky's pockets after he passed out and stole 10 bags of PCP from his jacket. Look, I don't know who needs to hear this, but please don't steal drugs from drug dealers, especially those that worship Satan.
Yeah, or don't be a drug dealer who gets so high all the time that he can't hold on to his stash.
Seriously, that's why they say you shouldn't use your own product. You know, acid king my ass, that's a rookie mistake. When Ricky awoke the next morning, he discovered a substantial portion of his stash had somehow gone missing, and he was pissed. But he probably never would have known it was Gary Lauwers had someone not ratted him out. What's that saying? Snitches get stitches? I don't know about that, but Gary sure did. Get stitches, I mean. After Ricky confronted him and Gary denied it, Ricky beat the living shit out of him until a pummeled Gary handed over 5 of the 10 bags of PCP he had stolen and promised to pay Ricky $50 for the 5 other bags he had used. But then, the damnedest thing happened. Gary didn't pay him. Now, I don't know who needs to hear this, but please don't steal drugs from drug dealers and then not pay them back for the drugs you stole from them after they beat the shit out of you. Especially those who worship Satan. And as time went on, Gary still didn't pay Ricky. So Ricky kept beating the shit out of Gary. Repeatedly. For weeks. Only stopping when Ricky caught pneumonia and had to be hospitalized in May of 1984. And while he was in the hospital being treated, Ricky's parents made a desperate attempt to have Ricky committed to a psychiatric facility. They told the doctors of his grave robbing, his daily drug use, and past suicide attempts, as well as his frequent threatening behavior. But there just wasn't enough grounds for Ricky to be held. Psychiatrists found Ricky to be antisocial, sure, but not presently psychotic. So they had to let him go.
Okay, that just feels like a major failure in the system. I mean, all of those traits are a cry for help. He clearly needed help.
Oh, 100%. 100%. But the thing to keep in mind with Ricky is, he's not stupid. You know, like, he knew what was up, and he knew exactly how to game the system. The same thing when he was in rehab years earlier. He was always able to convince doctors that he wasn't really an addict. He wasn't really a Satanist, you know, he wasn't really a threat, and they always let him go. So the next month, June 1984, the Knights of the Black Circle got the band back together, so to speak, when Ricky's best friend, Jimmy Troiano, was released from jail after having served 8 months. Naturally, the first order of business was an all-night dope fest in the Long Island forest. But everyone was surprised when Ricky extended an invitation to Gary Lauwers, especially Gary. Perhaps the time had finally come for Ricky to let go of the feud.
You're listening to an episode of Killer Heart to Hearts on True Crime by Indie Drop-In. We're going to take a quick break. And now back to this episode of Killer Heart to Hearts.
On June 19th, 1984, Ricky Casso, Jimmy Troiano, Gary Lauwers and another friend, Albert Quinones, all walked into a Long Island forest with a shit ton of PCP and LSD. And as they proceeded deeper and deeper into the forest, they noticed 3 crows ever-presently circling them overhead. Do you know what a group of crows is called? A murder. Once the friends found a suitable spot, they made their camp and took their drugs and did their best to light a fire to keep themselves warm and keep the darkness away, as if they could. And as the night wore on and the fire died down, Ricky suggested that Gary use his jacket as kindling to keep the fire going. Gary initially refused, but ultimately agreed to cut off the sleeves and eventually threw his socks in too. But fire consumes. And as this fire continued to burn, it wasn't long before more fuel was needed. And this time, Ricky suggested they cut off Gary's hair to use as kindling. Of course, Gary refused, but that mattered very little. There was nothing he or anyone else could do anymore to stop what was coming. Any of it. And as Jimmy held Gary down, Ricky cut off clumps of his hair with a pocket knife. When he was finally released, an increasingly panicked Gary Lauwers told Ricky that he felt that Ricky wanted to hurt him. To which Ricky replied, "Hurt you? I don't want to hurt you. I want to kill you." It was at that moment that Ricky Casso pounced on Gary Lauwers, biting him in the neck like an animal before stabbing him approximately 30 times. And throughout the savage attack, with each swing of his blade, Ricky kept screaming at Gary, demanding that Gary profess his love for Satan, over and over again, until Gary was dead and Ricky then gouged out his eyes. Ricky would later state that as he was stabbing Gary, Ricky noticed that one of the circling crows overhead began cawing. Something Ricky interpreted to mean that Satan had manifested himself as that crow, and that the cawing of the crow indicated Satan's approval of Gary's killing. Now, Gary Lauwers was a drug addict, to be sure, and a frequent runaway, so it wasn't unusual for him to go missing for a few days every now and then. And couple that with the fact that the crime scene was buried deep in the Long Island forest, and it's no surprise that Gary's body went undiscovered. But Ricky just couldn't shut the fuck up about it. Began bragging to friends about how he had killed Gary as a sacrifice to Satan. And one friend Ricky bragged to, a guy named Rich, at first didn't believe him. I mean, who would? But when Ricky persisted, Rich asked to see the supposed crime scene for himself. And the next night, the two headed out into the woods. And there, crudely hidden underneath a pile of leaves, now overrun with maggots, lay the remains of Gary Lauwers.
Okay, if I was Rich, I would actually be terrified that Rick would try to kill me too. I mean, I know these kids aren't the sharpest tools in the shed, but damn.
I know, right? Like, who goes out into the woods looking for the body with the dude who says he killed the guy as a sacrifice to Satan? Now, but imagine how relieved Rich must be now, though, looking back. Dodged a bullet for sure. And for 2 weeks following the murder, Ricky bragged about the killing. Yet all the while, paranoia was setting in. Until one night, Ricky and Jimmy returned to the scene of the crime to hastily move Gary's body to a shallow grave. A body so badly decomposed by then that as they did so, the head separated from the body. Soon after, in an effort to get the fuck out of Dodge, Ricky and Jimmy embarked on a cross-country California road trip. Fueled and funded by drugs, they planned to sell mescaline along the way. But back on Long Island, things were happening. As many as a dozen different teens in all got a tour of the crime scene with Ricky, but none of them said a word until July 1st, when police received a call from a girl claiming to know the location of Gary Lauwers' body and, more importantly, who killed him, Ricky Casso and Jimmy Troiano. But Gary Lauwers hadn't even been reported missing yet, even though it had been 2 weeks since his killing. So police dismissed the call as some sort of prank. But 3 days later, the 4th of July, Gary's mother confirmed that Gary had, in fact, not been seen in some time, and that she had received a disturbing phone call from someone who seethed, quote, "You'll never see your son again because I just killed him," end quote. Armed with a newfound sense of urgency and accompanied by a few cadaver dogs, police descended upon the location in the woods of Northport, Long Island, where the earlier caller had said Gary's body would be found. And there, the skeletal remains of Gary Lauwers were discovered in a shallow grave, decomposed beyond recognition. By that time, Ricky Casso and Jimmy Troiano had abandoned their quest for California and had returned to Long Island just in time for the 4th of July festivities. But, unbeknownst to either of them, they were both now wanted by police. And it wouldn't take them long. After a long night of partying, Ricky and Jimmy passed out in their car. And when they awoke, they were surrounded by more than a dozen police officers, all with guns drawn. Police had received a call about a suspicious vehicle and simply couldn't believe their luck when they discovered 2 murder suspects sleeping one off inside. Both Ricky Casso and Jimmy Troiano were taken into custody without incident. And at first, Ricky was cocky, denying he had anything at all to do with Gary's death, or any knowledge whatsoever about what had happened. But soon, his story changed, and Ricky, ultimately, confessed to the murder, even told investigators that Gary got what he deserved. Ricky seemed almost proud. We've now come to the inevitable portion of our story where everyone starts throwing each other under the bus. There truly is no honor among thieves. First, Ricky told Jimmy in a holding cell that he told police Jimmy played no role at all in Gary's killing, and that Ricky took full responsibility. But in actuality, Ricky told police that Jimmy was an active participant in the murder, that Jimmy helped chase Gary down, bring him to the ground, and encouraged Ricky to stab Gary and cut his throat. Even picked up the knife when Ricky dropped it and handed it back to Ricky so that Ricky could keep stabbing Gary. Now, Ricky also confessed to police that while he was killing Gary, he was praising Satan the entire time. The disturbing details of Ricky's confession prompted the Suffolk County Police Department to issue a press release stating that Ricky Casso was a member of a satanic cult and worships and partakes in rituals honoring the devil. The press release revealed that Gary's eyes had been cut out as part of a satanic ritual, and that the devil himself had ordered him to kill Gary Lauwers. And after that press release, all hell broke loose. In the ensuing firestorm that would later become known as Satanic Panic, media and suburban soccer moms everywhere took aim at role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, and rock and heavy metal music they perceived as satanic, or promoting Satanism or violence in any way. Anything that could potentially lead little Johnny or Susie into the devil's embrace. It was wild. Meanwhile, Suffolk County Police, however, believed Gary Lauwers' murder to be less about Satan than it was about something much more tangible or terrestrial. Drugs. But whether it was the devil or the LSD that made him kill Gary Lauwers, Ricky knew he was going to jail for it. For a very long time. And soon, he began to worry just what kind of a reception a self-proclaimed Satan-worshipping murderer might receive in prison. In the end, Ricky must not have liked his chances too much, because less than 48 hours after his arrest, Ricky Casso hanged himself with a bedsheet in his jail cell, as onlooking prisoners reportedly chanted, "Hang up, hang up."
See, this is interesting to me. I actually wouldn't have guessed Ricky's personality to be suicidal. I mean, I know that he had attempted this in the past, but he seemed more like someone who would do that for attention, but didn't actually want to die. I mean, I feel like everything he did was for attention. So this is just surprising to me anyway.
Yeah, I get that. But I think above all, Ricky was a faker. You know, a poser who took things too far and then found himself staring down life in prison. And he knew he just couldn't do that kind of time. He wasn't really about that life.
Yeah. And maybe when the drugs left his system and he had time to think about what he had done, the reality of it was just too sobering to bear.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. You know, he probably woke up and he was still high, so he was cocky, you know, saying Gary deserved it and shit. But then, I mean, that come down must have been hard. Ricky Casso's suicide left Jimmy Troiano alone to stand trial, as the fourth person in the woods that night, Albert Quinones, had quickly made a deal with prosecutors for immunity in exchange for testifying against the others. And Albert was saying that Jimmy held Gary down while Ricky stabbed him. And the physical evidence seemed to support that. The medical examiner concluded that the stab wounds to the body were consistent with someone being held down while someone else repeatedly stabbed them. Not only that, but Jimmy himself signed a confession, actually admitting that his part was to hold Gary down, but that Ricky did all the stabbing. A confession Jimmy then later recanted after Ricky's suicide before pleading not guilty. And Jimmy's new story was that it was all Ricky and Ricky alone. And the fact that Ricky took his own life before he could be cross-examined meant that his earlier statement about Jimmy's active participation in Gary's murder had now become inadmissible. Look, no one ever really doubted that Jimmy was involved. It seemed obvious to anyone watching, but proving it turned out to be a different story. Now, Jimmy wasn't doing himself any favors along the way, mind you. He gave his own lawyer, Eric Nyberg, at least 4 distinct versions of the events of that night, each just as believable as the next, while at the same time being completely different from the others. But if you think about that for a second, it makes sense. Jimmy had taken 10 hits of LSD that night and smoked bag after bag of PCP. No wonder he couldn't keep his story straight. He was tripping balls. But if that's true, attorney Eric Nyberg thought, that means Albert Quinones must have been tripping balls too. So, how could Albert's version of events be trusted? It was a brilliant defense, actually. All they needed was reasonable doubt, and Jimmy walks. Now, Albert Quinones had made a prior statement about seeing the hallucination of a lion in the woods of Long Island that night. However, under cross-examination, Jimmy's lawyer, Eric Nyberg, asked Albert if there was a lion in the woods that night, and Albert said no. But when Eric Nyberg next asked Albert if he had heard that a lion had indeed escaped from a nearby zoo that day, a dumbfounded Albert replied, "You mean that lion was really there?" And that was enough. Albert had admitted on the stand, under oath, that he couldn't discern the difference between hallucination and reality in his memory of that night's events. Albert then recanted his earlier statement that Jimmy held Gary down as Ricky stabbed him to death, and changed his testimony. He was now positive that Jimmy took no part at all in the killing, laying all the blame on Ricky, who, conveniently, was no longer around to say otherwise. Eric Nyberg got his reasonable doubt. After 3 days of deliberations, Jimmy Troiano was acquitted of the second-degree murder of Gary Lauwers. The issue of satanic cults was never even mentioned at trial. Instead, both the prosecutor and defense attorney agreed that Gary Lauwers had been killed in a drug-fueled rage for one reason and one reason only: because he stole someone else's drugs. Period. The rest was just mass hysterical noise. After his client's acquittal, as he left the courthouse, Jimmy's lawyer, Eric Nyberg, showed surprising awareness in the moment when he told reporters, quote, "There's proof of the defendant's guilt, but also reasonable doubt. I don't think anybody but God knows what happened that night." End quote. Well, and maybe the devil.
Well, I think it's clear that we'll never know how the murder truly went down. I mean, even Jimmy and Albert have no idea.
Maybe. I mean, that's one way you could look at it. Another way might be that after Ricky killed himself, there was only Albert's word against Jimmy's that Jimmy had anything to do with it. Remember, before his suicide, Ricky had implicated Jimmy as an active participant in Gary's murder. And discrediting Albert by proving how high he was that night might have just been a clever way for a guilty man to sow reasonable doubt and get away with murder.
Yeah, I mean, my impression is that Ricky knew he was going to kill Gary before they even went into the woods. I mean, he had been beating on him for not paying him back for the stash he stole, and it feels like this was just totally planned.
Oh, absolutely. That's why both Jimmy and Albert, and Gary, actually, I mean, probably especially Gary, that's why they were all so surprised when Ricky invited Gary to come along.
Yeah, and Ricky also, he just seems like the type of person who would have told his other two friends about his plan too. I mean, obviously I don't know that for sure, but based on how he acted after the murder, he seemed to just think that he was invincible. So if either of the friends knew, then that means that they would have gotten away with murder too. Maybe they didn't believe him, but Ricky kind of comes off as having been a super violent person and dangerous.
Right. So it's either they knew he was going to do it because he told them, or they should have known that something was going to go down because of what a violent sociopath he is.
Yeah. Also, why would Jimmy go on a trip out west alone with Ricky after Ricky and Ricky alone just murdered someone?
Yeah, I mean, you'd think Jimmy would have to have been involved for that to happen, right? Otherwise, he's just volunteering for a cross-country road trip with a friend of his who he just watched kill another friend of his as he supposedly sat back and looked on in horror.
Kids, take this as a warning. Don't do drugs. They make you do stupid shit.
Well, that is the end of The Acid King, you guys. As always, all of our information is in the show notes. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok for additional content. You can also check us out at our website, killerhearttohearts.com. Thank you so much for listening, and make sure to catch the next episode of Killer Heart to Hearts.
Killer Heart to Hearts is produced, written, and hosted by Elise Budell and William Cannon, and is engineered by Jordan Calhoun.
Thanks again for listening to True Crime by Indie Drop-In Network. If you would like to nominate a true crime podcast to be featured, just send me a tweet at Indie Drop-In. I'd also love to hear if one of our featured podcasts is now your favorite show. Indie Drop-In survives off ad revenue and listener donations. If you would like to contribute, please consider buying me a coffee. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/Indie Drop-In. If you look at the very bottom of the episode description, I put a link in there to make it really easy. Indie Drop-In has many other shows that you also might like. Just go to indiedropin.com. All right, see you next week.